You have published 4 books of poetry, 30 Miles from J-Town, Nights of Fire, Nights of Rain, Stone Bone Prayer, and most recently The Yellow Door with Redheim Press in 2015.
Right.
I think your books are all interconnected. They are different. Some of them have a very particular structure, like Stone Bone Prayer, but there are certain constants in your books. For example, identity, humor, mathematics, eroticism, and a major theme, I believe, is the fight against racism, prejudice, and stereotyping, specifically the negative stereotyping of Asian Americans and Asian American women. Your parents and grandparents, I believe, were interned in American camps during World War II.
Right.
What is your first personal memory of social injustice, of discrimination, and is that at the core of your birth as a poet?
You know, I'm trying to think of my first memory. I grew up in Sierra Madre, which is right next door to Pasadena. And I was often called Jap. So this is in the 50s. So World War II had occurred pretty recently. And there were still strong anti-Japanese feelings among a lot of the population. So the children, my classmates, who were just learning attitudes from their parents, they'd call me Jap. And I wasn't one of those kind of tough kids who would get in a fight and try to defend myself if I felt like I had been insulted or disrespected. I would cry. And I would try not to cry in front of them, because that would really be giving in to them. But it would hurt my feelings. So I have a lot of memories of that growing up.
Very early. Very
early, yeah. And my awareness of racism in Sierra Madre and Pasadena, where I attended junior high and high school, my awareness just kept growing as I saw the kind of attitudes that were really current at the time, I think, toward Asian Americans. So yes, it did definitely go into my poetry.
When you started writing poetry, that was the theme of your work?
Well, I was thinking back to my first poem was actually a protest poem, but not about racism.
Okay.
When I was a junior or senior at Pasadena High School, they had a literary magazine, and it was a protest poem against teenage conformity. Yeah, because teenagers tend to want to all be cool and all do the same thing. So I wrote a poem about that, even though I was very angry at the racism I was experiencing. Students would be nice to me up to a certain point, but I was not included in social activities. So by the time I got to UCLA, that's when poems about racism began to emerge.
Which year was this when you went to UCLA?
I was at UCLA from '65, started as a math major, and by '69 I was a militant, Asian American militant in what became the Yellow Power movement.
Wow.
So the first Asian American Studies class there was in 1969. I got to take it in my spring quarter. And it was the first time at UCLA that I got completely into a class. I felt like this is speaking to me.
This is, yeah. There are many examples of this fight against racism and stereotyping in your work. I have selected one poem. The title is "What is in a Name?" from your latest book, The Yellow Door.
What's in a name? Some of you are too young to remember the days when Oriental was a proper noun, a label thrust on us from outsiders who lumped everything into the term, from Oriental rugs and scrolls to teacups, swords, and silk kimonos. Oriental could be sexy, exotic, Madame Butterfly or Susie Wong, war brides and mail-order wives, or Oriental food from coast to coast, familiar as egg rolls and fortune cookies, teriyaki chicken, and pork fried rice. But Oriental was always devious, inscrutable, like Hollywood's Charlie Chan, ruthless as General Tojo or Genghis Khan. U.S. history was full of Orientalisms. No Orientals allowed posted on public buildings. A century of anti-Asian immigration laws. Oriental was the polite term to be used in public, while Jap and Chink were yelled on street corners, not a Chinaman's chance, an everyday phrase. We even called ourselves Oriental, just like Negro and segregation were in our national vocabulary, until rebels like Yuji Ichioka came along, coining the phrase Asian-American, a name we've insisted on ever since.
You are a Sansei.
Sansei,
third generation Japanese American, compared to Issei, which is first generation. Was Japanese spoken in your household?
No.
No.
My grandparents, 3 of them could only speak Japanese, and my grandfather on my mother's side was unusual. He actually went to Caltech before it was called Caltech in Pasadena, and he learned fluent English. So he's the only grandparent I could really communicate with. My parents were bilingual, but I think because of the camp experience, they weren't too motivated to have my sister and me learn Japanese. And unlike, there were a lot of Nisei parents who forced their kids to go to Japanese school on Saturdays. My parents didn't. My parents and grandparents on my mother's side were very, very westernized. Much to my regret, actually. I always kind of envied the other Japanese American kids who had more Japanese culture in their upbringing.
But you use some Japanese in your poetry. There's a poem, it's a nursery rhyme that includes some words in Japanese.
Right.
I have a question for you. Do you think that Japanese, I'm talking about the language itself, do you think that Japanese is somehow in the substratum of your poetic voice?
That's an interesting question. I don't think the language is, but I do believe in something called racial memory.
What is racial memory?
Well, it's something I kind of concocted.
Good, that's great.
But even though I wasn't raised to know a lot about Japan and Japanese culture, there's some sort of sensibility I feel I have, especially when it comes to my aesthetic toward beauty and my love of certain things in nature, like stones and pine trees and water, which is very much the area of Japan that I'm from, is on the coast. There are pine trees. I love stones. And my parents never tried to get me to like these things. My grandparents didn't, and I'm wondering, where is this coming from?
And you think that that racial memory informs your poetic voice?
I do. And it didn't, it really wasn't apparent in my first book, which was very much anger-driven. But I don't know if you'll be asking this later, but I've worked for about 15 years with poet Peter Levitt. And Peter Levitt is a Zen Buddhist along with a great poet.
Okay.
And he's a translator. And I feel that he helped me connect to that part of myself where the racial memory is. And
that's fascinating. That's fascinating. One of your books has a beautiful cover with the stones. It's a great cover. So let's go from one language to another language. I believe that for more than 20 years you were a math teacher, a high school math teacher. Did you work at Venice High School?
Venice was the last school I worked at.
Okay.
I worked there the last 6 years. My career was a total of 32 years for LA Unified Schools.
We can find a lot of poems in your work that are about math. For example, in the book Stone Bow Prayer, you have The Meaning of Zero, a love poem, Permutations, when geometry gets mixed up with God and the alphabet, the invention of mathematics, and then hints for beginning algebra students. Does your math brain talk to your poetry brain?
It didn't for a long time. But not for a long time. It wasn't until the third book, Stone Bow Prayer, that math poems started coming up. And I was so happy for that. And I'm not quite sure why they came up when they did, except I think it has something to do with aging, getting older. And because I started to enjoy teaching about zero and infinity more as I was getting older, which kind of makes sense, right? You're reaching maybe the end of one journey and starting something else. I don't know, but I was very pleased. And then the math poems, even now that I've retired, I keep writing about infinity.
In some of your poems, I see a lot of research behind. You have footnotes, you talk about the moon calendar that the Japanese imported from the Chinese. You talk about Japanese painters, Japanese poets. Do you do research, like scientific or research, before you write certain poems?
For certain poems, I do. For example, in the fourth book, the opening poem, Riding the Yellow Dragon, I did a lot of research on the role of dragons in Asian culture. It just so happened that we had gone to China in 2013, and then in 2012 I had started taking Tai Chi. Okay. And maybe around 2011, 2012, I wrote this little piece about dragons, but it didn't have any meat to it, so I began to research.
That's one of the poems I had as an example, like Riding the Yellow Dragon from your book, The Yellow Door. Could you read one of the math poems? This is called The Meaning of Zero, a love poem from your book, Stone, Bone, and Prayer. I
had written this down on this poem for some reading, and I'd like to share it. It's by a man named Charles Seif, who wrote a book on zero. And he said, zero and infinity are two sides of the same coin. It kind of goes right with this poem. So the meaning of zero, a love poem. And there's actually a quote from Pablo Neruda's The Book of Questions that says, is where space ends called death or infinity, a mere eyelid's distance between you and me. It took us a long time to discover the number zero. John's brother is afraid to go outside. He claims he knows the meaning of zero. I want to kiss you. A mathematician once told me you can add infinity to infinity. There is a zero vector which starts and ends at the same place. Its force and movement impossible to record with rays or maps or words. It intersects, yet runs parallel with all others. A young man I know wants me to prove the zero vector exists. I tell him I can't, but nothing in my world makes sense without it.
In your poem, A Question of Scriptures, from the book The Yellow Door, you say, I couldn't ask questions, held my poems in secret. Did you have a silent period as a poet? And how was your coming out as a poet?
My earliest poems that I wrote when I was in the Asian American movement, a few of those did get published. And then I began to become more and more left-wing and was studying works from China and Marx, Lenin, some other communists in the East European countries. And I was in these study groups where the kind of poetry I was writing, I could hear other people make comments like, that's really too personal and it's too kind of frivolous.
Yeah.
So it made me very, maybe secretive. I mean, other people didn't know I was writing poems.
So then at one point you decided to publish your poems, or to look for publishers?
Early 80s, I began to take some writing classes, creative writing classes. So I did sign up for a poetry class at UCLA Extension with Peter Levitt, who I didn't know.
Okay. And that was a very transformational moment.
Very. It completely changed things. So I took a quarter with Peter, and then he invited me to attend his private workshops off campus. And as I mentioned, then I was with him for 15 years. So the poems just started, I mean, they were flowing. All the stuff that had built up in me. The poems that were coming out were about Japanese American identity in the earlier years. And so I did begin submitting work around the mid-80s, slowly.
And then your first book was published in which year, you said?
In 1992. And that was the result of a poetry contest. And sort of an interesting backstory to that. In 91, I might have submitted to 2 or 3 poetry contests and completely forgotten that I'd done that. So in January of 92, Robert McDowell of Storyline Press calls me. I don't know who he is. I didn't recognize Storyline Press. I didn't remember I'd submitted. And he told me I'd won the contest. So by the end of that year, I got to go to New York City and read at the Nicholas Roerich Museum. The book won the Nicholas Roerich Poetry Prize. And that kind of got things started for me.
And that's 30 miles from J-Town, is that right?
Yes, it is.
You are a writer, but you are also the co-editor of the anthology Roots, an Asian American reader. That is yours, I believe, at UCLA. Could you talk a little bit about this project?
Right. It's very precious to me, this project. When I was at UCLA taking that senior class in Asian American Studies.
The first time you said, this is me, this is my class.
Me. For our term paper assignment, I wrote a paper called The Emergence of Yellow Power in America. It got published in Ghidra, the movement newspaper, and it also got published in the LA Free Press, which was kind of a more politicized version of the current LA Weekly. Okay? That essay, or term paper, got me a job at the UCLA Asian American Studies Center. They saw the writing and thought I had potential for their staff because they were just starting to build their staff. This is in 1969. So I became sort of a person that did lots of things, a teaching assistant for classes, a researcher. I remember I had to get research on Filipino Americans. And I eventually became their publications coordinator. And one of the things we knew we had to do was to come up with a publication that could serve Asian American Studies classes because there were no books at the time.
I see.
Giving us what we needed for our classes. So with Franklin Odo and Eddie Wong and Buck Wong and myself, we co-edited Roots in Asian American Reader. For those early years of Asian American Studies, it was the only book.
Yeah, that was the anthology.
Yeah, that was the anthology. And it was different too, you know why? And again, here, maybe I had more poetry in me than I realized. The section I was responsible for was the identity section. And there were a lot of poems that we put in there. Lots of poems. Your
poems are included in this anthology, Grand Passion, that was published. It's an anthology of LA poets. I think it was published 20 years ago or 21 years ago.
Yes. Was it really?
Yeah. I think it's 1994, something like that. And then your poems are also included in the new anthology, Wide Awake.
Right.
So we have been active in the poetry world of Los Angeles for the past more than 20 years. What do you see in the poetry writing in Los Angeles, and which kind of trends or styles and changes you have seen in the past 20 years?
Well, it may be my imagination, but it seems like there's an awful lot of poets out here now, which is wonderful. It's like, I mean, they're everywhere, and the number of readings that are going on, the whole arena of spoken word, performance poetry, that's a huge group of people right there. And the number of people of color, like myself, that are writing, that's gratifying to know there are a lot of us doing poetry also. Then it's funny because when you put a time frame on it, there are us old timers, you know, like Suzanne Lummis and me, Eloise Klein-Ely. I mean, we've been around for a while. It's very exciting for me to see some of the new poets that are on the scene now.
Is the Amy of that anthology of the beginning of your career the same writer as you are now?
Parts of me are the same. I think the anger-driven part.
Is it still alive?
It's still alive, and I keep writing political poems. In fact, I have a fifth manuscript that I hope to find a home. And
is it finished?
Yeah, it's done. And it has many political poems that talk about my objection to things like drone warfare, some of the violence in the schools that goes on, violence, and also just the terrible education that our students are getting. So that's protest. Again, protest, that's a certain theme. But I think, I hope, what is different as I've matured is poetry that is gentler, hopefully wiser, more attention to nature. And I've also started to venture more into prose poems. And I find that I enjoy writing prose poems.
When you look at all your books and all your poetry production, how do you feel?
I feel lucky. That's the first word that comes to my mind, is I feel very lucky, because the world of poets and poetry publishing, it is so competitive. And I feel there are far more great poets out there than published poets. You know, I mean, I wish there were more ways a lot of people I know could have books and be published. I lucked out. I lucked out and won that contest, and then once you win something like that, the second book came almost automatically. And you know, my life as a math teacher, and as just a single mother, I never could have predicted that I would have had 4 books in my 60s. I would have been, as you know, writing poetry, I think I would have been okay with the 1 book, you know? So this is just extra, it's dessert.
Let's close with one last poem. It's from The Yellow Door, your most recently published book, but it has lines, I believe, from a poem from your first book. The title is Nursery Rhyme.
Okay. This was written in 2 periods, because the first part of the poem is in my first book that was published in '92. Back in the '80s, I remember at one workshop, Peter asked us to write a nursery rhyme. And I'd never written a nursery rhyme, and I went home, and my son was off in the house someplace doing his homework. My son might have been around 10 or so, I'm not sure. And the nursery rhyme just, you know, you get those poems that it just comes. So it just came. And it does include some Japanese in there, which I'm not even sure if it's correct Japanese. The term nenne yo, I think of it meaning as something equivalent to go to sleep. And to dako, dako is when people pick a baby up and they go like this, so you're carrying them, but you're also sort of
soothing.
Yeah, soothing
with
them.
Some movement.
So dako is a word I do remember from hearing my family speak. The second part of the poem was written more recently when my first grandson was going to be born. Nursery rhyme. 1. Nenne yo, baby in the snow. Mommy gonna dako you, hold you while you grow. After you cry, mommy hold the sky. Mommy gonna let you go, baby gonna fly. After the snow, mommy gonna go, baby gonna sing goodbye, nenne yo. Part 2. Nenne yo, baby starts to grow. Grandma waits to dako you, kiss you on the brow. After you arrive, the sky will come alive. So many eyes shall glisten, the oldest ones revive. After you grow, you'll soar the sky, you know. The stars will sing hello to you, nenne yo.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariana.